Hello, everybody. I am Candy Sedabaka, the Denver City Councilwoman for District 9, and I'm coming to you to explain to you a process called redistricting and to walk you through a map that I have drawn and am proposing for a vote in the next couple of months. So let's get started. So what is redistricting? A quick overview. Every 10 years, we get new census data that tells us how many people are in our city, in our state, in our country. And we take that information and we draw district lines at the city level, the state level, and the federal level to make sure that our districts evenly spread our population out. That's important for representation because when we split budgets at the city level, the state level, the federal level, we're splitting them with the idea in mind that these districts are even in size. And so you don't want to have lopsided districts because then it makes it challenging for overpopulated districts to represent their constituents fairly with the same amount of resources as potentially underpopulated districts. Here in Denver, right now, District 9 is currently the largest district in the city. The ideal size of a district is about 65,000, and District 9 currently has over 76,000 people living in it. And so what this means is that during this process of redistricting, District 9 is going to have to shrink. So there are 3 sets of criteria that I'll be walking you through in this presentation. The first set of criteria for redistricting is the mandatory criteria. This criteria is set forward or given to us in our city charter, which is basically like our city's constitution. And the 5 criteria in the charter are that we must have 11 total council districts, that they must be equal in population, that they must be contiguous territory or connected, they must be as compact as possible, and they must contain whole election precincts. What's important about these criteria is that that equal in population, that ideal size that I mentioned is 65,000. So we can go slightly above or slightly below, but it has to be within a specified deviation. And then with the contiguous territory, it has to be connected, but it doesn't have to be connected on multiple sides or anything like that. And then the piece about as compact as possible. So there's no real metric that tells us how compact is compact enough. But what we're trying to do essentially is keep them as small and compact as we possibly can, given the other conditions set forward. The whole election precincts one is a challenging one this year because with the census data, our clerk and recorder at the city level had to redraw election precincts. And so they're a little bit larger, but that is the smallest unit we can use to draw these maps. Meaning when we're drawing a map, we have to draw the lines based on how big the election precinct sizes are. So that gets tricky when we get to our far northeast neighborhoods like Montbello. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that later, but I just wanted to flag that we don't get to make the precinct size. The precinct size is already predetermined by our clerk and recorder. So city council members have to draw maps based on someone else's work. So keep that in mind. The second layer of criteria, council guidance. So council passed a resolution this year, or actually 2021, setting forward guidelines or other parameters that we would follow in addition to the mandatory criteria. So they were as follows. Number 1, the largest council district cannot be more than 10% larger than the smallest district. 2, race and ethnicity shall be taken into consideration to the extent necessary to comply with the Voting Rights Act. Number 3, district lines will follow obvious geographic boundaries to the greatest extent possible. District lines will respect neighborhood boundaries to the greatest extent possible. Council will preserve logical communities of interest and the core existing constituencies traditionally represented by a particular council district to the greatest extent possible. And district lines to the greatest extent possible will not result in 2 incumbent district council members residing in the same district. So if you'll notice, I've highlighted or underlined that very important language, to the greatest extent possible. Because we cannot define definitively these criteria, we have to try our best, but there's no measure that says we've met that threshold that is the best. So keep that in mind, that's important as well. Number 6 is interesting because it's saying that we must try as hard as we can to draw districts around current council members' homes. That gets challenging in my map, but I can assure you that I tried to the greatest extent possible to meet all of these criteria. Equity criteria. This is a 3rd layer of criteria that I personally have used to draw my map. And this is based on an equity framework that council agreed upon. And this is based on my own personal values and general principles of, I guess, getting around or preventing gerrymandering. If you've heard of gerrymandering, it's basically how maps in the past and currently have been drawn to serve special interests or to marginalize particular groups of people. In the criteria before, you noticed that there was one criteria about taking race and ethnicity into consideration as necessary to meet the criteria of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was federal legislation that was designed to protect minority groups' ability to elect representation that reflected their values and reflected their demographics. That is my primary focus with this equity criteria. Now, this is my own criteria. This is not a layer of criteria that council has agreed to. I have proposed it, and I hope that they will use this criteria when we select a map, because what happens is we're in the map drawing phase, and then council members will choose a map that they support. It could be multiple maps, it could be a single map, and we basically end up voting amongst ourselves, council members, to decide which map we go with. And so if you if you've looked at the maps proposed currently, because all the maps that are going to be proposed are proposed. If you've looked at them, every single one of those maps had to meet that first layer of criteria, the mandatory criteria, to even be allowed to be proposed. So every single map, map A through, I believe it's B, C, D, E, F, G, they all meet that first layer of mandatory criteria. That second layer of criteria is subjective. So we all believe that we've met that criteria. And this third layer, when you understand and research gerrymandering, the way that gerrymandering happens is through cracking, packing, or stacking. Cracking is diluting historically marginalized voters. Packing is concentrating historically marginalized voters. And stacking is when you put minority voters with a larger set of active voters that are white voters who will overpower the vote of the historically marginalized group. That's the easiest way for me to explain it. So my equity criteria tries to make sure that we don't crack, pack, or stack historically marginalized voters. And when I say historically marginalized voters, I'm talking about Black and Brown voters, Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other minority voters. The other two criteria that I added are a little bit separate. We had a very strange census year because it was during the pandemic. Historically marginalized neighborhoods are typically known to be undercounted on the census. And during this pandemic census, we know that they were undercounted. So we take that into consideration in this map that I've drawn. And we take into consideration past and future growth trends. When I say that, what I'm talking about is where we concentrate and zone for growth in our city, which has been predominantly in the core or the inverted L, which is heavily in my district currently. So I'll show you that. I'll point that out when we get to it. I like to call my map, Map A, the equity map. This is a quick glance at the map that I'm proposing. We will look at it in a bunch of different ways as we go through these slides. So, communities of interest. Early on in the process, there were digital tools that were made available to the public to draw their own maps or at least identify communities of interest on a map. What that means is that if you are an individual in the public, you had the power to highlight on a map special areas of the map that you thought should be protected or kept together in this redistricting effort. There were, as you can see, over 190 proposed or identified communities of interest. And those were taken into account to create this map on the right side. So the map from the people was here on the left, and it was synthesized and turned into this map on the right. This is called a layer, a communities of interest layer. And so all of the colored chunks on this map on the right are communities of interest that I attempted to protect or keep together to the extent possible within the parameters of the mandatory and council criteria and equity criteria. But I wanted to show you that layer just so you have an idea in your head of what we're talking about when we talk about communities of interest. And if you'll notice, this pink block here is a huge block in District 9. And so I absolutely tried to protect that huge block there in my redraw of our district. I wanted to show you all this map because of that criteria about the taking race and ethnicity into consideration for the Voting Rights Act. This map on the left is from 2010, and the one on the right is from 2020. What this shows us is the change in our minority population over the last decade. If you'll notice the green areas on the map, those are majority minority communities or neighborhoods. Clearly, there was a shrink from 2010 to 2020, but I want you to notice the boundaries of the map that I'm proposing and the green blocks on this map. That's very important because in my effort, what I'm trying to do is preserve the voting power of minority communities. And in order to do that, we must remember we must not pack, stack, or crack those communities. And so the opposite of packing, stacking, and cracking is making sure that we appropriately keep communities of color, together and maintain as many majority minority districts as possible, because if you have a majority minority district, then those districts have the power to elect a minority candidate or a candidate that reflects the interests of that population. I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit of a mouthful. These next couple maps are important because they're connected to the previous map, but they dive a little bit deeper, and they aren't necessarily showing you majority minority neighborhoods, but they're showing you the concentrations of our voting age minority populations. So if you'll look at this map here, the dark purple areas are our heaviest concentrations of our voting age Black population in the city. This was a really tough one because you'll see later on that we don't have a single district that could be majority minority Black. None of the districts top over, I think it's, we'll see a little bit later, but none of the districts top over 8% in majority Black status. So what I tried to do here with these lines, if you'll notice them, is to maintain our Black community together to the extent possible so that they can retain their voting power. This line on the far right, where we have to split District 11 off, follows the path of capturing the most precincts containing the concentrations of our Black population so that we preserve their voting power. It gets tricky in District 9 because District 9 currently includes this huge little chunk here of Skyland, Whittier, looks like City Park West. These areas are already in our district. And so what I wanted to do was not cut them out of our district, but try to increase their power, their voting power, by appropriately moving the line to grow my district, to capture the population that we need to capture, or to keep our population at that, as close to that 65,000 number as possible, but also to not dilute the power of the Black vote and voice in our community. The Latino population, if you'll notice here, I was very intentional in the same way in keeping the Latino population together. I in fact decided to move slightly to the west of my current boundary line to capture pieces of Sunnyside, because if you'll notice, District 1 historically was heavily Latino, but over the years has seen a decrease in the Latino population. And so the highest concentrations of Latinos in that district were kind of on an island by themselves. And so I looped them into our district to ensure their voting power and their voice was more prominent in being able to elect representation. So that is, and then also down here with District 3 and District 2 in the South, I wanted to make sure that we didn't cut off just an island crack the Latino population down here in District 2. I wanted to make sure that they had some voting power. And so if you'll notice, that's why the Latino population is split between 2 and 3 rather than 2, 3, and 7 as it's currently split or proposed to be split in other maps. That's important to note. Our Native American population is a very small slice of our population, but I wanted to show you both their population and our Asian population to show you where there were concentrations of these ethnic groups, ethnic racial groups, so that you can kind of see why the lines are where they are. Specifically, over here again in the far northeast, and down here in the south, and in our district as well. Here is our Asian population. Definitely wanted to keep their voting power as strong as possible. And so that is why District 8 dips down and captures some of our East Colfax neighborhoods. It maintains their power by looping them in with these blocks up here in the northeast. This is an important one. Foreign-born population is our immigrant population. Wanted to show you all how that breaks down. You basically just saw me unpack potentially who the foreign-born population captures, but this is a higher level view of that population. Language is important because it helps us also make some educated guesses about the demographics of our community. So wanted to show you this layer as well. The darker green, it is our folks in the city who speak another language other than English. The lighter it gets, the lightest is English, the darkest is a language other than English. So it's kind of just showing us the concentration and distribution. People living in poverty was really important to me because when we talk about communities of interest, we're talking about people who would have issue areas in common, who would, in theory, want to be able to fight together for the solutions around those issues or themes that they have in common. Having a group of people who live in poverty can be powerful when you're selecting representation, because you would want representation that cares about wage inequality, wealth inequality, economic opportunity. And so that's how this community of interest breaks down. And of course, it often does break down this way in every community, but it does align with some of those racial and ethnic lines that we looked at previously. This is directly connected to our people living in poverty slide. This shows us the heat map of people who are cost burdened or paying more than a third of their income on rent. And this is important for the same reasons mentioned before. If you care about displacement, affordable housing, you're obviously going to want to be able to elect representation that also cares about those things. So it's important to keep these communities' voices strong and together, and not dilute their voice by adding higher income or lighter purple areas in to the darker areas in a way that overpowers the darker areas' voice. Unemployment, very, very same thing. The darkest levels of our map here are the highest concentrations of our residents who are currently unemployed. The lightest areas are people who are employed. I'll show you an income map later, but this is important because I wanted to make sure that that map around unemployment makes sense too. So we want to know, where do our elderly people live? Where do our youth live? And so this is a good heat map showing you our concentrations of people over 65 throughout the city. And so the far northeast, near northeast, are a place we want to protect that voice. But we also have these pockets down here in the southeast that we don't always talk about. But if you look at the line for the new District 4 and 7, this is a very different type of line for them. District 4 and District 7 have never looked like this before and have been traditionally more isolated from the challenges the center of the city face, and they were drawn in a way that doesn't actually allow or empower the voices of, say, for example, these people over 65 or people living in poverty. Let me actually scroll back to that so you guys can see this yellow line and how I drew it along the communities living in poverty to make sure that their voice was not diluted by our much wealthier residents in the lower part of that district. These people living in poverty very likely want and deserve a stronger voice when it comes to how our city is changing or moving forward. And so that yellow line is controversial, but I wanted to make sure that you understand that it was to empower and give voice to this community of interest living in poverty, this cost burden community, this unemployed community, these people over 65, these people under 18. Every single map is showing us that that slice of our southern map is very different than the one below it. And so they need to have the ability to elect representation that has very different interests than the ones below the yellow line, if that makes sense. Adults without a high school diploma. The darkest areas of our map are people with diplomas. The lightest areas of our map here are people without a high school diploma. And so you'll see below that yellow line, District 7, highly, all of them, or not all of them, but you can see that there's a heavier concentration of people with high school diplomas below that yellow line and up this central area. And so just wanting to help you make sense of these new, very different lines that stretch upward into the center of the city rather than maintaining our southern districts in a more isolated way. Another map, this is important for us to understand where our folks with disabilities are concentrated. We always want to protect that community of interest. And so I took this into consideration. Historic redlining grades. We always want to make sure that we are remembering the inverted L, its impact, and doing all that we can to dismantle the government neglect, the government disinvestment that happened as a result of redlining, as well as many other inequities that correlate with our red line or inverted L in the city of Denver. This is 3-year-old children not in pre-K. So that's a community of interest in itself. Wanted to show you where they are. It aligns with our race ethnicity maps, poverty maps, but wanted to make sure that you could see it visually. 3rd grade students not great at reading level. Very similar intent here. SNAP eligibility. That's public assistance eligibility. So we want to make sure that people who need those resources have somebody who's telling them about those resources and cares about those resources and expanding those resources So this is another map that's very important, especially for District 4 and 7 down here in the south. Food deserts. This is huge. Community of interest. We want representation that understands what a food desert is, understands the challenges, and wants to advocate with and on our behalf to make sure that we don't have any food deserts anywhere in our city. Teen births, a community of interest we need to take into consideration. People who are uninsured, another one. The darkest areas are the heavier concentration of people who are uninsured. The lightest areas are people who are insured. No internet access. Median household income. This one's really important because the darker areas of this map tell us where we have the highest income households in the city. The lightest areas tell us where we have the lowest income households in the city. And that is important because we don't want to stack districts with high income earners who have very different interests than low income folks and could potentially overpower their voice or have the privilege to not necessarily do it intentionally, but do it unintentionally because they have the resources to be able to participate differently and at higher levels. Cost burden housing, very similar. It shows us the opposite of that median income map. Park distribution. This is not super easy to see, but I wanted to be able to show you the visual representation of really our lack of park space, but showing you how the districts, the new districts that I'm proposing, at least give some access as much as possible, as fairly as possible to each of the districts. And I know you all can't see this very well here, but I will have the link available so you can dive deeper into the presentation, but also another link for you to check out the maps themselves and turn off and on each of the individual layers. This is very hard to see, but this is our school distribution, not super relevant, but you know, some people care about where our schools are at. So I wanted to make sure that was included. Rec centers, we know there is really not enough rec centers or not enough of our regional rec centers in our neighborhoods that are most underserved or highest concentrations of minorities. So wanted to give you that visual representation. This was the hardest one. These are our statistical neighborhoods. And so our statistical neighborhoods are super important in this conversation because we want to keep them together to the extent possible. And I can assure you that that was my first priority, to keep them together. And then when we layer on that equity map, and we had to cut some neighborhoods in half, those cuts were based on those other equity layers related to income, related to other communities of interest, to preserve voice and representation. These are some snapshots that I think are really important to take into consideration. So when I told you earlier that magic number is 65,000, this map is in compliance with the required deviation from that 65,000, but I wanted to give you guys a visual representation of the district sizes so you can understand my rationale here. So when I was thinking about what districts should start underneath the 65 and over the 65, those two criteria about future growth and past growth trends and census undercounts were what I used to make those decisions. So for example, District 4, 2, 6, 5, those have historically been more stable neighborhoods that have seen lower levels of growth or even shrinkage in their population over the last decade. And so I started them slightly above the 65 within the allowable limit because if we move forward with those same growth trends, then they're unlikely to exceed the 65,000 or the set parameters around population as fast as some of these other areas where we know that there were undercounts and we know that we've concentrated growth in those areas and are expecting major growth in those areas. So I started off, of course, our District 9 area and our District 3 area far below, and District 10 far below the 65,000, because these are places where we are fully aware of planned growth. For example, in District 9, we have huge growth coming to us along where Denargo Market is at and where National Western is at. And in District 3, we have the Sun Valley area being developed. In District 10, we have parts of the Colfax corridor. So these are District 8 will have areas of the Colfax corridor where we've put the bus rapid transit. So that's why I started these ones off lower, below the 65,000 limit, and the other ones above it. The only one that was very challenging for me and everyone else drawing a map was District 11, because of the way that our city is laid out. The airport is a really hard one to keep at a reasonable level. And this is like something we are going to have to tackle in the future. But as that area is growing and we're taking into consideration all of these other parameters about not cutting neighborhoods, maintaining voice and representation, we can't necessarily continue on without addressing that issue. But I started them right exactly at 65,000, knowing that these are equity neighborhoods and they will be experiencing growth in the future because we are putting a lot of our affordable housing out there. And so this one was slightly uncomfortable, but I kept it as close to the line as possible. Same with 1, but 1 is pretty much, to be frank, gentrified fully. They've fully turned over in District 1. And so starting that one at 65,000 felt a little more comfortable than District 11. So that's an important one. This is an important slide. This red line here just shows us the 50% of the population and highlights that there's really only one district that is more than half Latino, and that's District 3. A couple other ones come close, but District 3 is the only one over 50%. With our white population, I wanted to show you this because I know you've seen other maps, and some of our other maps propose one more majority white district. There are 13 votes on city council right now. And so a majority vote is 7 votes. And other maps are proposing 7 majority white districts. Our map is keeping it at 6 intentionally. And I wanted to call that out and show you where those were at. Our majority Black districts, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation, none of our districts have over 25% Black population. And so District 11 is the only one that comes close. And we need to be conscious about that, because when we're grouping the Black community with another community, my preference is to group the Black community with the brown community to maintain that majority minority power given that a lot of our other communities of interest or issue areas are basically, they break down along race and ethnic lines. And so just wanting to show you here the distribution of our Black population across the city. This is just a quick snapshot of how map A, or the equity map, meets those 3 layers of criteria, meets all of the charter mandatory criteria, meets almost every one of the council criteria, except for that one piece about drawing around council members' homes. There is one district where we're actually drawing it, and it captures 2 city council members. So that one is one where I've acknowledged I've fallen slightly short, but it was to the extent possible given the other parameters. So technically it does meet the criteria, but I wanted to call it out to, be accountable for that and explain to you that while it didn't fully draw around council members' homes, I did it to the extent possible, given the other layers of criteria that I've applied. And then, of course, my equity criteria here, it was completely based on that criteria. So, of course, it met all of the criteria. These are upcoming meetings and opportunities for your participation. So check it out. You can either show up in person or virtually to see the other maps, get other folks to explain. Different council members are hosting in their own communities. Not every single one is hosting. Some of them have teamed up. We are hosting at Manual High School on the 23rd. So definitely check that out. Each of these meetings is going to give you an opportunity to select the map of your preference via a poll. So go to all of these meetings ready to vote with your phone or a laptop or tablet, something that you can access the internet with. They will give you a code and you will go in and choose the map that you like the most. I hope you'll choose map A. Map A has really been my effort to capture everything that you all have submitted to us through town halls, through public meetings, through emails, through social media, through your own maps. We took all of that into consideration. I hope that this presentation explained to you the reasons why lines were in certain places. I am completely open to moving lines if anyone has recommendations about how to do that. If my colleagues want to move lines, I am willing to negotiate as long as we maintain those equity criteria at the forefront of our decision making. Happy to accommodate and make a map better. So please dive a little bit deeper. I will put the link to the actual map and the map tool so that you guys can go in there and play with the layers, toggle on and off, and see the other maps with the same layers underneath them. Hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for participating, and please make sure that you stay tuned after you watch this to see how we vote and see how the process unfolds further. Take care, and thank you for allowing me the great honor of representing all of you. All the power to all my people. Adelante.